Okay, welcome to day 3 of our summer training series, Brain-Based Advocacy for teens in foster care. And this is day 3. We are going to be talking about adolescent development today. We have a lot to cover. We'll be using some breakout rooms today. And so we are going to just jump right in, and this will set the stage for next week, where we'll really start looking at brain development and how that fits into all of this. Okay, so let's get started with some questions here. So when you think of adolescents, teenagers, preteens, when you think of that population, just in general, take foster care off the table, in general, what are some words that come to mind? And feel free to just fill those up in the chat box. Risk taker, yep, thanks, Rhonda. Opinionated. And if you'd rather just unmute and say your word, that's fine too. Transitioning, changing, promising, moody.
Hormones.
Hormones, thank you, Betty. Explorative, confused, anxious, great.
Social balance.
Yep, social balance, yeah, that's a good one. Rochelle says creative, goofy, curious, bold. I should have done this in one of those word clouds, right? That would have been fun to see. Great. Okay. So let's think about this. Overwhelmed, great. Let's think about this, in the context of just in general, but then also maybe thinking about it in terms of our work with youth and teens and foster care. One of the things that I think is interesting is that we have a tendency, particularly with youth and care, to describe young people by their behavior, right? We have a tendency as a society to use the words like rebellious or, those kinds of things that we think of that come to mind, right? It makes sense that we would think that way. That's kind of how, if you think back to your own teenage life of, often being summarized by your behavior, positive or negative, right? Like, oh, Nancy was a really hardworking 16-year-old. She, had an after school job and all of this. And, Kara was a bit of a troublemaker, right? I'm just making all these things up. Was a bit of a troublemaker, always getting into things. And we tend to summarize and describe young people by their behavior because that's what we can see. It's kind of it's that low-hanging fruit, if you will. But here's the thing that I think is important, or is an important pause point for us when we're talking about this in the context of child welfare, is that when we describe children and teenagers only by those behaviors, as we tend to do, it sometimes has it can limit opportunities for them in the future. And, an interesting thing here is that, we talk about teenagers in general and then teens in foster care. When we apply that lens of child welfare, that's a pretty harsh lens that we as a system view children through. So let's think, if you all could think about the worst thing you ever did as a teenager, or the biggest risk you ever took as a teenager, a time you broke the rule. Right? I can see some blushing here as you all are thinking about it. That thing that you did. And now think about those same things in the context of how we would respond if that were a child in foster care. So if you learned that a child in foster care had snuck out of the house, snuck into their significant other's house, and was found making out with their boyfriend, right? Think of all the things that would happen as a system to address that behavior. Or if you think about a teenager who is found smoking, or a teenager who steals liquor from the kitchen or from the liquor cabinet at the house, or a teenager who skips school, or who is mouthy, or maybe steals something from the local pharmacy or the local drugstore or something, steals makeup or something. If you think about all those things, now I might have describe some of the things you were thinking about, right? I'm not going to ask anyone to out themselves, but if you've ever, as a teenager, snuck out of the house or broke a rule or weren't where you said you were going to be. When we look through that lens of child welfare, we tend to view those kind of somewhat typical and expected, right? Expected behaviors, those expected risks and expected kind of boundary testing that teenagers do. But when it's a child in foster care or a teenager in foster care, it has the potential to change the entire scope of their lives and their entire future because of the way that we tend to respond to those things. So I don't know that I have the perfect answer to that, but that's the kind of context that I want us to keep in mind as we're moving forward today and then through the rest of our session together. So let me go back here a little bit. So when we're thinking about young people, oftentimes young people are trying to, if we really boil this down, are trying to kind of answer and figure out these questions like, who am I? Who in the heck am I? What do I stand for? What am I all about? And then there's always this question of, am I normal? Am I different? Am I the same? How am I normal? How am I different? How am I the same from my peers? Right? We're all trying to figure that out as teenagers. And then how do I fit in here? How do I fit in the context of my family, of my friend group, of my school, whatever it is, right? We're all kind of navigating this. And to a certain degree, we're all, even as adults, we're all still navigating that. But as teens, especially, we're kind of trying to figure it all out. And trying to find and establish and learn about those boundaries that are going to kind of guide us throughout our lives. So in your handouts, I want to talk, kind of setting the stage here a little bit. And your handouts on Google Classroom, you received I think the handout is called Normal Development Tasks Required to Transition from Adolescence to Adulthood. And it really kind of has those expectations for adolescents, right? So we expect, if you remember when we were talking about our goals for children in the future, a lot of that has, to do around, adjusting to this new sense of self, thinking about the future in terms of career or higher education, trying to figure out peer relationships. That's all part of the business of being a teenager. So this first column here is, what we expect all adolescents to do, what we expect to kind of happen during those teenage years, right? Things like kind of adopting and figuring out their own personal value system, or, figuring out and managing their sexual identity or their gender identity, working on impulse control. That's often a growth point. We see a lot of that boundary testing. So working out those types of maturity type things. That's all teens. We kind of have those expectations of that time. And a lot of the words used to describe adolescents and teens fell within that vein. Now, there's some kind of what ifs here. So if we're thinking about youth who have experienced foster care, so this middle column describes some experiences that might impact what we expect of adolescents. So things like, I've been so focused on my survival just every day, just surviving each day, that it's hard for me to see into the future and to see what comes beyond next week. So when we're thinking about typical adolescence and we're talking about going to college, when we're working with a teen in foster care, it doesn't mean we don't talk about that 17-year-old in foster care about college. It means that we need to keep in mind that their experiences, that road getting them there, looks a lot different than young people who haven't experienced foster care, for example. And then there's also some cultural considerations, if based on the child's identity or based on, any number of things, of just considerations, things to think about of, I don't feel like I'm good enough because of, I am a member of the LGBT community, and, the place where I'm living and the school I go to, I'm not sure if I'm accepted and welcome there. So that's this kind of other factor, this other piece that weighs into it. Was everyone able to download and access this on the Google Classroom? I know sometimes when I hyperimpose them on the slides, they're really hard to see because the text gets really tiny. But it's there under the third module on the Google Classroom under handouts. And you can see the full document there. We're going to use it here in a few minutes. So now let's keep this conversation going. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how do you think things like race, gender, or identity might influence our perception of youth behavior? Does anyone have any immediate thoughts or reactions to that question? And feel free to unmute or use the chat box. And if we're having trouble getting going, I'll ask a direct question of, do you think there's a difference in how we react to a 16-year-old boy engaging in sexual behavior versus a 16-year-old girl engaging in sexual behavior? Do we think there's a difference in the way that we view those things as a society?
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. How are they different? Does anyone want to expand?
I think that no matter what the issue is, if it's race, gender, identity, anything like that, we all have these preconceived ideas of what those should mean, and whether we're conscious of them or not, I think that we make perceptions about them, or we just think that certain things are acceptable or certain things aren't due to societal norms and or our own personal bias.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anyone else have thoughts to add? Yeah, Frankie shares in the chat that society is less likely to view a male sexualized behavior as normal, but as a female, right? We use those derogatory terms like whore, slut, all of those things that we talk about. You know, when we tend to view women differently, women and girls differently than men and boys. Absolutely.
I think also that when you start to label certain teenagers, that you might see their behavior as expected, more expected. Like, let's say that it's an LGBTQ youth, you might think that some of their outbursts or negative behavior is due to that label that they have, but it may just be a normal teen behavior that they're going through. So we kind of attribute their behavior to the label that we're giving them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, you know, and all of you are making excellent, very accurate points. And I think our, you know, the data supports it. When we think about, when we look at our statistics of youth in foster care, when we look at suicide rates of youth in foster care, children who identify with minority communities or with, you know, the LGBT community, those suicide rates in foster children are much higher, or attempts are much higher. And so I think when we think about all of that together, that's a lot to unpack with that. Julie also shares, society has defined what are kind of girl roles and what are boy roles, right? Even in the way that we direct towards certain roles or careers. And, you know, a lot of times I don't think that's intentional, right? That we kind of do that. It just kind of happens naturally, and we don't always realize that it's happening as it's happening. Rhonda shares kind of misunderstandings of behavior related to culture can impact our perceptions of a young person's behavior. These perceptions can determine how we accept these children or don't accept them, unfortunately. Absolutely. Yeah, especially when, you know, we all come to this work, or, kind of to our jobs each day or to our work each day, kind of carrying all of both, kind of society's influence and then our own personal implicit biases that kind of contribute to all of this. So this can become a really tricky conversation and become a really tricky situation. And I wish that there was some magic tool or checklist or something that would just, set us all, reset us all here. But I think thinking about this and kind of always bringing it up and using this lens when you're working with youth and teens to kind of say, hey, I'm having this reaction to what I'm reading or what I'm seeing, or this is kind of the conclusion I'm jumping to. Have I considered everything here? And really applying this lens regularly is an important step. So let's do a quick breakout. I'm going to send you randomly into breakout rooms in pairs. And so if you have the handout that I just showed you, the developmental task handout, the one with the 3 columns, if you have that handy, that will be helpful. And so your task in your breakout room, we have about 5 minutes in there, is just choose whatever random developmental task from the first column. So just kind of choose one. And then thinking about, and based on what a youth in foster care might say and some cultural considerations, what is one thing that you could do to assist? Oh, I see a typo there too. What is one thing that you could do to assist a young person with that particular developmental task? So if the developmental task is preparing for a career, what's kind of something that someone's experience in foster care might impact that developmental task? And then, what kind of cultural implications are there? And while considering both of those, applying those lenses, think about something that you, as a supportive adult, could do to assist or support that young person in completing that developmental task. And you can pick whichever one you want to randomly. So you'll have about 5 minutes. Let me get them set up. Sorry, I'm clicking all over the place. I'm sorry. I can share the list if folks don't have it handy. Let me pull it up here. I thought I had it so I could drop it in for you guys, but I must have forgotten to get that done. Sorry, take me just a second and I'll drop it in the chat for you. Okay. So there, I just file dropped it. It's in the chat now, so you should have access to that to download it nice and handy. And you'll be in breakout rooms of 2 or 3 in each room. So just go ahead and let's see here if I can make sure I get you all in rooms of. So some of you will be with 3, some will be with 2, and just feel free to choose a task and then apply both of those lenses, and then you can go from there. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the breakout rooms, talking and trying to type at the same time. I just will not do those 2 tasks well. So, okay, now you're ready to go into your breakout rooms. If you have any trouble, feel free to send me a message. I'm going to be out here in the main room if you need anything. Sarah, were you able to get into the room? Sarah Grace? Oh, okay, cool. Like I need to not push the red button in the future. So I'd love to hear, we won't have time to hear from every group, but I'd love to hear from one or two of you, an idea you came up with about how you might assist a young person or support them in kind of that developmental milestone or task. Someone wants to share.
I'll go ahead and share, Jenny. Frankie and I had the task, how do you assist youth in foster care with developmental, oh, wait a minute, I forget what the title, oh, career goals, sorry. And we just talked about making sure that they have access to somebody who's actually in that field, maybe providing them with some kind of shadowing opportunities, making sure they understand specific courses, you know, if they're younger and they're in high school, what may be required from a course standpoint to go into that field. Like if you're going, I think Frankie mentioned a dental assistant or something, you want them heavy on science and that sort of thing. Debbie, or I'm sorry, Frankie, was there anything else you wanted to add? I think that's the majority of what we talked about.
I mean, your idea about connecting them to someone who is currently a student in the field was an excellent idea as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and those are things that we can do in our work with teens and young people. And sometimes even if it's just, if there's an interest in something, finding a way to kind of stoke that fire. So if it's, the 12-year-old says, I want to be an astronaut, let's unpack that rather than saying, well, becoming an astronaut is really, really hard. And instead, what's exciting about being an astronaut? What are you interested in? And see what we can do to kind of fuel that fire of interest, because maybe they'll be an astronaut, maybe they won't. But, when we find those little nuggets of interest and passion, finding a way to encourage those things and create additional experiences around that. I can't remember if I told you all last week about the time we had a teenage boy who really wanted to be a park ranger. And so I just, by circumstance, happened to know someone who works for the US Forestry Service. And we arranged for him to have kind of a ride along one day. And he is not a park ranger, but that kind of sparked an interest in him. And now he is a wildfire firefighter. That's what he does for a living now. So kind of cool that, just creating those opportunities that a lot of children have that might be outside of the reach of children in foster care are great strategies. So perfect. I'd love to hear from one more group. Did anyone have a different task, not one that wasn't career or goal oriented?
I had some ideas on the expand verbal skills.
Great.
Tanya and I talked about there is a wide range in difficulty in terms of helping adolescents with these. Some are a lot more straightforward, but I thought making it sort of a game or a competition or a challenge would be really fun with adolescents. Have an app that has a word of the day every day, and then have a competition to see who can use that word of the day in the most relevant situations, like using it in a sentence when you're writing a paper at school or doing things like that, just to encourage learning new words and using them, because you won't remember them if you don't use them, but to really make it fun, and also just encouraging joining a book club or being part of something that is, because reading that really expands verbal skills as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I know, I don't want to steal Kara's thunder, but I know that she has been known to read the same book as her teenage client. And then that kind of gives them something to talk about, and they kind of read it at the same time and then discuss it. So you can have kind of this one-on-one book club, which is a neat way to, you're fulfilling and kind of building that resilience and helping with that development, while also it's a great rapport building technique. And we can get creative, right? None of these things are, so often, especially in CASA or in this kind of child welfare space, we tend to think of the case, of the legal case. What are you going to recommend? What are you going to file? What are, all those things. But there's lots that we can do in the spaces between those official points of our role that can have a really big impact. And I think that's, you know, what makes our work so special. Great. So we're going to shift a little. We're going to keep building on this conversation, but I wanted to introduce you to a term that maybe you've heard or maybe you haven't. It's a term coined about 15 years ago or so by John Saida, and it's called family privilege. So we talk a lot about male privilege and white privilege, and, you know, all of these socioeconomic privilege, all of these things. One that we might not think about is family privilege. You know, if you remember from, I think it was week one, or it might've been, I think it was week one when we were talking about all of how complicated it can be for a child in foster care, for a teen in foster care, to have those typical experiences that we expect most adolescents to have by the time they're an adult, or to, you know, have exposure to. And so this term, family privilege, was coined, and essentially is saying, you know, there are kind of benefits that are mostly invisible, but benefits that come from a membership in a stable family, right? We know this. We say, you know, we kind of talk about having a stable family as such a great predictor of future adjustment. You know, so it's not only is it that support and that pathway, but it also kind of comes with this invisible package of assets. And that could be financial, but it could be, you know, intangible things, you know, that kind of sense of belonging, sense of safety, those kind of, you know, spiritual commonalities, all of those types of things. You know, when someone grows up in a stable family unit, even just being able to observe success within their own family creates a certain degree of privilege that sometimes children in foster care don't have the opportunity to experience. So thinking about this, what are some kind of quote unquote normal experiences or typical experiences that most teenagers would have, or those kind of invisible assets that maybe a child in foster care would be disconnected from? So what are some of those things? And to get you thinking in the right direction, I'll share an example. I think I shared about this last week. You know, a privilege that comes with kind of having a stable family is having a place to go when you're on break from college, having a place to go home when you're on holiday from college. I think that that's, you know, is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about here. Or being able to visit, to go to your friend's house when you're a teenager, go have a sleepover with your friend. What other examples are there? Yep, Rhonda shared just kind of family traditions, right? Yep, Nancy shares a good one. Foster kids often have to go to respite rather than participate in a family vacation. Yep, we've seen that happen a lot. Having that support system, you know, having your people that kind of have your back, right? That's often lacking when a child emancipates from foster care. Any others that we want to add to this list? I think about, you know, just celebrating those holidays. Kind of, Rhonda mentioned the traditions of who's making the turkey and who's bringing the mac and cheese and who's bringing the green bean casserole, all those things that you talk about as a family. Sense of belonging, someone and something, not having a consistent role model, absolutely. Having people that really know you, like people who kind of know where you come from and know what you're about, absolutely. Great. I think we're getting better at this as a system, but even just access to general extracurriculars is sometimes a challenge. You know, I think about, you know, and all of you think about your own children, grandchildren, and you know, I have a child who was kind of interested in guitar, so it wasn't that hard for me to figure out how to get him a guitar and get him guitar lessons and kind of, right, fuel that interest that he had. And sometimes those just really don't fall on the radar when we're talking about youth in foster care. Yep. Oh, Rochelle, she says she gave a kid a cake once and they said it was their very first cake. He was 18 years old. Absolutely. I'm sure that was very special for him, Rochelle. Consistency, having the like pride of taking your family members with you to school activities. Absolutely. You know, even thinking about, I always think here at OU, right? Mom's weekend, dad's weekend, Sib's weekend, those things hit a little bit differently when you don't have people to bring on campus for those things, and participating. And, it's all levels. I think about for myself, I think many of you know, or maybe I mentioned it, I was adopted from the Ohio foster care system myself. And, I obviously have parents, my adoptive parents who, would come with me to those kinds of functions. But I recall in junior high school being kind of devastated when we had to do an entire assignment and assessment and presentation. We had to do a booth and costume and food and all this about our heritage. Like, are we Irish? Are we Italian? And you had to kind of do a whole presentation about it. Of course, I can't answer that question for myself. So, for me, it was more than just stressing out about an assignment. It was, it kind of brought up all of these other questions for me. So even just things like that can hit a little bit differently when you're missing some of those pieces to the puzzle that someone who has, whatever degree of family privilege might not even fall on their radar or even kind of be something they would ever have thought about or considered before. I know when we were doing events with CASA, we had our reindeer games this year, and we kind of we had a Santa that came and did a little thing for the kids, and we had to coach Santa on not saying, tell your parents, but instead saying, tell your grownups, and just kind of being mindful of the language that we were using, because we don't want to, the holidays are already kind of a pain point when you're not with your family, regardless of what the holiday is. So being mindful of those things and just thinking about them a little bit differently is sometimes a good point. Great. Oh, see, I always get ahead of my slides here. What you see on your screen here are some questions that are actually in your second handout for this day. And I'm going to drop that in the chat here too, if I can figure out how to do that. Just so you have it handy. The PDF is in the chat now if you want to download it. It's a handout that says Think Back, and it has some colored bars across the top. I'm going to give you all about just 5 minutes or so. If you want to jot down on a piece of paper or just think about these things, these questions, think about this in reflection through your own life. So I'll give you 5 quiet minutes to kind of write those things down and think about them, or however you want to do. And you don't have to answer every single one. Just kind of think about them, and we'll come back together as a group. It's always hard to tell when we're not in person if people are kind of done writing and thinking, but we'll start to come back together. And obviously you can continue to reflect on this even after this session. So I am interested in hearing from you. And now some of you might have written down, some of the questions that were very specific of what kinds of support did you receive? What was a risk that you took and the lesson you learned from that risk? How did your network of support respond to the risk that you took? All of those types of things, right? We could go on and on telling all the stories of our wayward youths. But instead, I'm interested in asking 2 questions. And the first is, what were some of the positive memories you have of your older adolescence, of your teenage years? Does anyone want to share first? Yes, Sarah?
I didn't think about it until just now in this session reflecting, but there were so many different times during my teenage years that my dad showed me that no matter what I did, he was there. He had my back. And I think that's probably the strongest positive memory, is that if I was out late, he's like, it was partly this teen management, but he's like, I'm going to come looking for you. And that while it was also parenting, it also provided safety. I knew if something happened, he was going to come get me. And but then even if I screwed up, he always was always supportive, and I knew he would always have my back. And so I think of how much that meant to me as an adolescent, and what a difference it made as I transitioned to being an adult, is just knowing that was there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how, like, the farther away, like the more we kind of can reflect back on a period of time, the more abstract our memory of it becomes, right? Your memory is of kind of your dad's relationship with you and how that impacted so many experiences versus, it's probably, it's not one singular event necessarily. So it's interesting.
Yeah. I struggle to think of books or songs or shows, but I could remember this feeling of being supported.
Yeah, great. Nancy shared she liked her job at a VA hospital, living at home, not so much. Rochelle shares kind of having memories of experiences, not necessarily toys and things. Stephanie shares she grew up in Meigs County and everyone knows everyone. So if you needed a correction or kind of needed some guidance, you would get it out in the community. Absolutely. I similarly grew up in a community where everyone knows everyone, and there was lots of parenting happening, regardless of where you were or whose family you were around. Great. So now I want to move to that kind of second abstract question. Think back to your teenage years or your older adolescence. What were some of your worries during that time? Things that weighed on your mind, things that stressed you out that you kind of still think about. Oh, people are sharing in the chat here. Too far. Fitting in, lots of fitting in, worrying about money, peer relationships. Yep. Worrying about disappointing people. Absolutely. Yeah, I similarly think about one of the worries that I couldn't really identify now, which now I can look back on and understand a little bit more of what was shaping that experience, was, having like a fear of rejection or a fear of not being accepted or not being good enough, kind of colored and influenced a lot of my behavior and decisions as a teenager. Clothes, money, boy problems, kind of hanging with the right crowd, worried about making huge mistakes. Absolutely. Yep, high achievement, like, I think putting a lot of pressure, there's a lot of pressure. Absolutely. Nancy talking about, worrying about having to be independent before she was really ready. Absolutely. Yeah, so we have kind of a range of things, and even just here, right, we all share something in common. We're all in this summer series together. We all have this interest. We all kind of do the same type of work, and look at all the paths that each of us have taken. So while I can see commonalities and themes between what everyone is saying, there's also just such a range of experiences, which I think is an important point for us to remember as we move forward. One thing that I, draw out here, and Sarah's point when she shared about her relationship with her dad and how that was kind of a positive memory as she looked back was, and for some of you, it might not be a parent, right? It might have been a grandparent, an extended relative, a teacher. But, a lot of times when we think about, who was in your network of support, who helped you along the way, all of those things. I hope that we are emerging and seeing this and the importance of that kind of supportive adult in your life. We talk about that a lot. There's a lot of research behind just the presence of a single, stable, supportive adult in a child or teen's life, how much that can impact future outcomes, impact their likelihood of having a stable, livable, living income when they are older, of not being homeless, of going on to, successfully raise their own families and have healthy relationships, even how important that one person can be. And I remember one of our early discussions, we talked about so often we're focused on those tangible task things in child welfare. So if there is a relative or a supportive adult out there, we're looking in the context of placement. And if as soon as we figure out, right, that, oh, nope, they can't go live with this person, they can't go live with their soccer coach from the second grade, we kind of move on from that person, and we really, can kind of pedal back a little bit and look at how can we create this network of support. I think it was Tanya who had shared in one of the earlier sessions about, kind of creating that network and that web of support in between all of the big system decisions that we make. There's a lot of work and potential for us to do some really meaningful support in between those big moments in our work here in child welfare. So as we kind of wrap up for the day, I do want to share an audio story, and this is it's really quick. It's only about 1.5 minutes long, but we're going to hear the voice of a young person who will share his experiences to some of these questions, the questions that you just asked, answered in your worksheet.
When I think of one of the biggest disappointments that I experienced through my adolescence, it actually has to do a lot with friends. I think when you grow up in the foster care system and there's so much paperwork for it to do the simplest things, like spend time at someone's house, and then you have people asking, well, did everybody get a background check, or sleeping over their house, did everybody get a background check? Being able to go places with people, you don't really get those normative experiences. And then because you're always switching around or your relationships are being disrupted, you just sometimes feel like you're just lucky to have certain friends. And I think the influence on that is that we don't really get to practice choosing our friends, because then it's like you just default to having friends when they're around. So one of the big disappointments of when I look back at my adolescence is that I didn't get to engage in what it meant to really have long-term friends, what it meant to have friends who I actually chose. And it wasn't because I was the new kid on the block and they were the new kid on the block, or we happened to relate on that level. When I think about what young people need as they're going through the system, is that they need to have practice with who they let into their lives and who they don't let into their lives, and how they set those boundaries. But if you're always having to start from square one, you don't actually get to practice those things.
So that was pretty brief, but pretty impactful. And I think summarized a lot of the things that we've been talking about, but obviously through this context and lens of a lived experience. So any first thoughts or things you noticed about his experience, points you want to draw out or note as you were listening to that kind of 90 seconds of his response?
he didn't have a choice. His life was pretty well directed, who was in his life and who wasn't.
Absolutely.
And he didn't really get to form, those best friend relationships, because he could have been moving around so much that, those take time, and time's not a lot of what he had.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's like a certain lack of autonomy even.
Right. I was thinking that in this system, there's so many other people who are making basically every decision for you. You don't have a lot of autonomy, even in things like maybe you're going to school just like all the other kids, but you've already decided that you're going to be moved around so much and you don't even have control of that.
Yeah, is it worth it for me to try to build these, to establish and kind of break in here? Nancy shares that every teen she's worked with has said, quote, they just want to be normal. Hard to have this sense of normalcy when you're like kind of living this experience. Rhonda shares eye-opening to realize he did not even have the power and control or kind of the choice of who he elects to spend time with. Tanya shares a good point that, normalcy is this great policy shift that we're seeing in Ohio, but not every county applies that policy the same. So there was some legislative work in Ohio to promote those normative experiences for youth in foster care. And I'll share in the Google Classroom a link if you want to read more about it, about the bill and about the legislation. And it's been a couple of years now that it's went into effect. One thing it did was establish a reasonable and prudent parent standard, which in theory was to allow youth in foster care to have more of these normative experiences. And as Tanya points out, it has been implemented differently in every single county in Ohio. So there's not a lot of consistency and guidance in how to turn that policy into practice. And so goes the ongoing drama of, Ohio's legislative of hurdles that we follow, to kind of see that intersection of policy and practice coming together, sometimes very easily, and sometimes it comes together like a bit of a train wreck. So we're kind of figuring that out, but I'll share some more details on that legislation and on that policy and rule change as well. Yes, Sarah shares, about kind of that feeling of normal, that teens just want to kind of fit in. And so all of these rules and restrictions, one, make it hard just for them to practically do these things, but then it also creates this stigma. I mean, could you imagine, thinking about sitting around the lunch table at school and talking about, meeting up at the movie theater or the arcade after school, and everyone's kind of, oh, this, I'll check on this. I'll make sure my mom says it's okay, or, all these. And then another one is, the child in foster care is, well, I have to call my caseworker. I have to call my foster parent, like all of these steps that need to be followed in order to be able to do that thing. That can get pretty complicated. So maybe, as Kara said, maybe just not even bother to try. Great. Okay, so that brings us right up to the end of our session today. We have just a few minutes. Any final reflections or thoughts before we close today's session? All right. There is a reflection question in this module. Some of you have already answered it, but if you want to go in and contribute to that discussion, it's just, each day as we kind of build on our discussion, what you think you could implement or might incorporate into your practice with young people. Next week, if you're a nerd like me, you're going to love it because we're going to be talking about the brain. So we'll really deep dive into some of that. Brain development and how that creates this extra layer of complication for us as we move forward. But it's an exciting one because as much as it complicates things, it also gives us a lot of insight that we can use to improve our work. Okay. If there are no other questions, we'll sign off. I'll give you 2 minutes of your day back, and I will see you all next week. Bye, everyone.